Good afternoon. Welcome to Nature Immersion. Let's wrap up our two-part video series on the consequences of planting exotics instead of natives. We're going to finish the reading from Bringing Nature Home from Douglas Tallamy. Biodiversity is essential to the stability, indeed the very existence of most ecosystems. We remove species from our nation's ecosystems at the risk of their complete collapse. But biodiversity also plays an important role in the efficiency with which ecosystems function. Ecosystem efficiency can be determined by measuring how long energy is retained in an ecosystem before being lost. Not all species use energy with equal efficiency. When a community has many different species, the chance that some of those species will be efficient energy users increases. Energy flowing through ecosystems with many types of species is therefore used more efficiently and with less loss to the surrounding environment than energy entering simplified ecosystems. More energy in the system means that the system will be more productive. It will produce more plant and animal biomass, that is, weight, and from a selfish human perspective, produce more ecosystem services for us, make more fish, more lumber, more oxygen, filter more water, sequester more carbon dioxide, buffer larger weather systems, and so on. So, are introduced species good or bad? You might wonder why, if diversity is such a good thing, everyone is so concerned about the addition of species that evolved elsewhere to North American ecosystems. This is a good question, which scientists are still debating. To date, some 50,000 alien species of plants and animals have colonized North America. Not all are invasive, or not yet, but many have penetrated every natural area in the country. Some people claim that alien species actually increase the diversity of the region they have invaded and therefore are ecologically desirable. I could not disagree more. If you simply count numbers of species, the species diversity of an area does rise after aliens invade, at least until they outcompete the natives for space, light, water, and nutrients. Diversity, however, is not a panacea in and of itself. The benefits of diversity enumerated above are not realized unless the species in an area are functioning members of an interacting community. If an alien plant penetrates a native plant community without decreasing the density of any of the existing species, its presence in that community may well be benign. Often, however, aliens colonize disturbed areas faster than do native plants, and then subsequently prevent native colonists from reestablishing the plant community that was in place before the disturbance. For an alien species to contribute to the ecosystem it has invaded, it must interact with the other species in that ecosystem in the same ways that the species it has displaced interacted. In other words, it must be the ecological equivalent of the native species it replaces. Let's take as an example the invasion of the Florida Everglades by Melaleuca quinquenervia, the paperbark tea tree. Melaleuca was imported from Australia as an ornamental tree in 1906. It is a highly adaptable genus and can grow well in either dry soil or standing water. When humans lowered the water table over much of the Everglades, Melaleuca quickly invaded and it has now almost completely displaced native grasses on hundreds of thousands of acres. Where Melaleuca has invaded, our treasured river of grass has become a dense forest of alien trees that are completely useless to the creatures of the Everglades. When I say Melaleuca has almost completely displaced native vegetation where it has invaded the Everglades, the operative word is almost. If you were to measure plant diversity in a Melaleuca grove, you would probably find a few isolated individuals of most of the plant species that dominated the area before its arrival. If you are particularly hard-nosed, you might look at the entire Everglades and conclude that Melaleuca has not caused the extinction of a single plant species. Local extinction doesn't matter if one is simply listing the number of species that exist in an entire region. Your survey might actually show that the plant species diversity has increased by one since the arrival of Melaleuca in the Everglades. What would be missing from your survey, though, is a measure of what Melaleuca is contributing, or more aptly, failing to contribute to the Everglades ecosystem, compared to the grasses it has displaced. Melaleuca has transformed the sunny, wet grasslands it has invaded into deeply shaded, drier forests dominated by a single species. The grassland birds that breed in the Everglades cannot nest in Melaleuca groves, and they find fewer insects to eat because native insects cannot eat Melaleuca leaves. Alligators cannot make their wallows or find food in Melaleuca groves, and so they have lost hundreds of thousands of acres of habitat. Butterflies cannot find their host plants, egrets cannot hunt the fish they eat, and hummingbirds cannot find the nectar they need to survive from day to day. Even though the number of plant species present in the area is higher by one, the ecological interactions that drive the Everglades ecosystem have collapsed where Melaleuca has invaded because its dominance contributes nothing to other organisms. Diversity is important then only when the species that can be said to create it are contributing members of the ecosystem. This contribution is most likely when species have evolved together over long periods of time. The example of Melaleuca underscores how important it is to keep aliens that do not function within ecosystems from displacing the plants and animals that do have critical roles in their ecosystems. This is best done by maintaining the full diversity of native organisms in an ecosystem. It is well known that alien organisms invade faster and do better in disturbed sites. Translate disturbed to mean areas from which species, whether a few or many, have been removed. Although natural disasters happen, the disturbances I am talking about are almost always wrought by humans. How do we know the actual extent to which our native insect generalists are eating alien plants? We don't until we go into the field and see exactly what is eating what. Unfortunately, this important but simple task has been all but ignored so far. My students and I have been working to fill this gap in our knowledge, and despite the fact that most of our studies have not yet been completed, they take years, preliminary data are starting to accumulate. One of the first things I did was compare the diversity and biomass of the insects that were developing on the four most common woody natives in our yard: black oak, black cherry, black walnut, and fox grape, with the insect diversity and biomass on our five most common alien plants: autumn olive, mild minute-weed, oriental bittersweet, multiflora rose, and Japanese honeysuckle. Following standard protocol for sampling diversity, I found that native plants produced over 4 times more herbivore biomass than did alien species, and supported 3.2 times as many herbivore species. When I compared natives and aliens in terms of their production of Lepidoptera, which are moths and butterflies, the largest diet component of insectivorous birds, I found that the native plants in the study supported a whopping 35 times more caterpillar biomass than the aliens. We know that most bird populations are limited by the amount of food they can find. So if there is 35 times less food available for birds in habitats that comprise primarily alien plants, there will be 35 times less bird biomass in those habitats as well. No wonder our birds are struggling. Data from this experiment can also be used to determine whether generalist insects are compensating for the loss of specialists in the production of insect biomass. Because I had collected all of the insects on the target plant species, I could identify them to species and compare the biomass of generalists produced on aliens with that produced on native plants. After eliminating all the specialists produced on natives, as predicted, the alien plants in my study produced no specialists. I found that natives still produce more than twice as much generalist biomass as did aliens. That is, I found no evidence that generalists are able to use alien plants at the same rate they use natives, and I certainly did not find that generalists prefer to eat alien plants. Do alien plants harm birds? 2 studies have been published that document bird declines in areas heavily invaded by alien plants. In the first study, Aaron Flanders and his co-workers compared bird communities and replicated 200-hectare plots, about 494 acres, within 2 South Texas rangeland habitats. The first habitat was made up almost entirely of native grasses and forbs, whereas the second was dominated by 2 invasive alien grasses, lemon lovegrass and bufflegrass. Both of these species were introduced in the 40s to restore overgrazed rangeland. Their introduction was a success, and today they have replaced native vegetation in millions of acres throughout the Southwest. The Flanders study showed that restructuring the grassland plant community with alien plants has, in turn, restructured the insect community and the birds that depend on insects at the study sites. Both arthropods and insectivorous birds were significantly more abundant on the plots that still had native vegetation, 60% and 32% respectively, as compared to plots invaded by lovegrass and bufflegrass. A second study conducted at Medicine Lake National Wildlife Refuge in Montana suggests that the results of the Flanders study do not represent an exceptional pattern, but will most likely prove to be the rule. John Lloyd and Thomas Martin compared the breeding success of the chestnut-colored longspur in patches of native prairie and patches of prairie invaded by crested wheatgrass, a species introduced from Asia that as of 1996 has spread over 10 million acres in the West. They found that longspur nestlings reared in areas dominated by wheatgrass grew more slowly and were smaller than nestlings reared in native prairie vegetation, an obvious sign that food was in short supply in alien wheatgrass. Being small is dangerous in nature, and nestlings in the wheatgrass were 17% more likely to die on any given day than nestlings in native prairie grasses. The results of these two studies should come as no surprise. Removing the food, native plants, of the food, insects, that birds need to rear their young will result in fewer birds. So those are only some of the consequences of bringing in alien ornamentals, and I really want to suggest Bringing Nature Home: How You Can Sustain Wildlife with Native Plants by Douglas Tallamy, a professor and a scientist doing scientific research out in the field